Sargon thinks that Rome's never-ending reserves of manpower came from their being unusually democratic. He contrasts the Romans with what he calls aristocratic Greek societies, who he thinks were afraid to own their people. Now, the Roman aristocracy were absolutely terrified of their people. They regularly set up death squads to go after members of the populist party, sometimes state-sponsored like under Sulla, sometimes privately managed like the ones that went after the Gracchi. So in other words, despite the tribunes and the assembly of the tribes, the Romans weren't anywhere near as democratic as some of their enemies that they easily outnumbered, like the Athenians or the Aetolians, who were a representative federalist state. So it certainly wasn't because the Greek societies were afraid of their people and the Romans weren't. Another little problem with Sargon's position is that neither the Greeks nor the Romans actually owned their soldiers at all. The soldiers were expected to provide their own weapons. The Romans eventually started providing their soldiers with weapons in the imperial period, but in Pyrrhus's day the legionaries were still expected to provide their own equipment and not have it provided by the state. So you see, the political differences between the monarchies and the democracies and the Romans weren't really important. Rather, it's an economic matter. That's why the Romans were able to put together much larger armies more reliably than their rivals. I think the Romans are most like the Spartans, partly politically with their elected office holders and dual monarchy and the consuls of Rome and the two Roman houses of Sparta, but mainly economically. The Spartans split up all their land into equal plots for the citizenry, and obviously it was mainly worked by slaves, or helots rather, and the Romans had the Aga Publica, which were public fields provided for the sort of working class farmers who became a yeoman class, who could be soldiers who would provide their own equipment at their own cost based on the profits of the public land that they were allowed to rent. Another economic similarity between the two two polities is that they both used iron as currency. This allows inflation and economic activity can improve. When you've got silver or gold currency, it's very difficult to use a small enough unit of currency to exchange for everyday items like a loaf of bread or something like that. So it's much easier if you use iron spits or iron coins to allow the economy to inflate as economic activity expands. Otherwise, the limitations in the money supply can result in a limitation of economic activity, and therefore less people who can afford to provide their own weaponry and other military equipment. Another similarity between the two is that they had a relatively small number of slaves. Although the Romans eventually turned Italy into a big series of ranches manned entirely by slaves, in the earlier period they had a relatively free population. On the other hand, Sparta, of course, was mainly staffed by helots, but the helots were still trusted to be armed, or at least the Laconian helots, not obviously the Messenian helots, were trusted to be armed, and at Thermopylae there were 3 times as many helots as there were Spartans, and they all died with their masters. And this is how Sparta were able to punch above their weight, for example at the Battle of Plataea, where they had 40,000 soldiers despite their total population being 8 or maybe 10,000 citizens. And so you see, the difference was not in how scared they were of an armed population, sorry gun control opponents, but rather the difference was in how many of their people could actually afford to arm themselves for battle and go off and fight. And that is why the Romans were always able to provide as many soldiers as they needed, whereas, say, the Macedonians weren't.